Alright, so let's look at Dart classes, and there's an example over here of a class with 3 properties, 2 constructors and a method. So let's look at this, right? So let's just go through it, line by line. So class, this is the keyword which is used to define the class, and this is the name of the class, which is Spacecraft. So this defines a class called Spacecraft over here, and with the curly braces, basically you enter into the body of the class, right? The class has 2 properties called name of type string, which is probably going to hold the name of the spacecraft, and there's a launch date of type date time question mark, right? So this question mark basically says, that this variable launch date can either contain an object of type date time, or it can contain the value null, right? So this means that launch date is a variable of type date time that is nullable, so it can hold a null value as well. It's going to have a launch date, if the spacecraft has been launched, and it can be null if the spacecraft hasn't been launched, right? Then there's a getter over here. So this is called a getter, which is basically defined by using the keyword get. The getter returns a value of type int, which is nullable, so it can hold a null value, and it basically, the name of the getter is launch year. So this basically tries to provide you a way of getting the launch year using an object of the class by calling this particular getter, right? And what this does is that basically returns, and this is a shorthand notation that we had seen earlier. This basically checks the launch date variable, checks whether the question mark again over here says that it checks whether the launch date is null or not. If it is not null, it will get the value of the year, right? This is the property year from the launch date from that object, and in case it is null, it's going to return a value null into launch year, and that value is going to be returned to the calling code block. So, and since this can be null, or it can have an integer value representing the year, the return type for this is int with a question mark. So it's a nullable integer, right, value. Then we have a constructor. So a constructor basically helps you construct an object for the class or an instance for the class, and in this case, this is the main constructor, right? With syntactic sugar, which basically means that it's shorthand. It's defined in a shorthand notation. Generally, constructor is not generally, but constructor is actually a function. So for a function, you would need to provide arguments with a type and a name of the argument, right? But in this case, you can see that's not done. A shorthand has been used, and that's why it's mentioned as syntactic sugar. And this just means that whatever are the two values provided over here, those should directly be assigned to the name and the launch date property over here. So that's the syntactic sugar over here, right? Okay, so next we have a named constructor. So Dart allows you to have multiple constructors. So this is like an additional way you can construct an instance of the class, and this has to be given a name, which you actually specify like this. So over here we are trying to provide a named constructor, which is to actually create an instance for a spacecraft that hasn't been launched, right? And why would we do that? Because for a spacecraft that hasn't been launched, you would assume that you just need the name. There's no launch date. So instead of creating a spacecraft object with both the name and the launch date, you would just call the named constructor, and you would just specify the name, and that would help you create an object. So this might seem trivial right now, but when you're actually dealing with objects with multiple properties, with classes with multiple properties, this is actually pretty handy to create instances of that class in different ways, providing only part of the property values and then assuming defaults for the other. So over here, what this does is this named constructor uses this colon over here, which basically passes on its arguments to the main constructor, which is represented by this, and this means that whatever is the name that you provide this, it's going to pass on to the main constructor, use that name for the name variable, and a default value of null for the launch date, right? And that is how this named constructor will create an instance, and this instance is going to be returned to the calling code block.